is Mark 14, verses 3 through 5. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly.
Turn it off. Good evening or good morning. I guess it's morning time, isn't it? Sometimes we forget. As we get started this morning, I look out and I see a full house, and I want to remind everyone, I mentioned a couple weeks ago, after the first of the year, we're going to be doing a series of lessons out of the book One Word, and this is the book. It's a book of really family devotionals is what it's meant for. It contains 53 weeks, in case there's 53 Sundays, but 53 weeks. Each lesson is a single word. Under each lesson, there's going to be 5 devotionals. And the idea is that during the week, you would do those devotionals with your family at home. For example, the first lesson is Word. Isn't that nice? One word. The first lesson is Word. And so there's 5 quick devotionals for your family during the week. You may do Monday through Friday. You might do Tuesday through Saturday. But you do those 5 devotionals during the week, and then on the Sunday we'll come together, and our lesson will be over the same concept. I'm not doing the 5 devotionals. I'll be doing my own lesson on the word, for example, and giving deeper insight into it. So the idea is that we as a church family get to spend time all week together, albeit in our separate homes, but at least we're on the same pages, as it were. And then when we come together, our lesson will be drawn from it. And so we'll do one word each week, and the church has purchased a book like this for each of your families, one book per family. And when we mentioned it, we had some, and we ran out. Some of you didn't get a book, but we have the books in. So if you've not received the book, they're on the table back behind the coats in that corner there. There's several stacks of them there, so be sure and pick up one for your family. And then we'll start, actually, I think it's on the first Sunday is, I think, January 6th. And so it will be, the last couple of days of December there leading up to January 6th. So you can start your devotionals at that time. So you do want to go ahead and get your book. We've got a couple weeks before we start, but I think this will be something good for us to be on the same page together from week to week as we look to grow and serve Christ every day during 2019. Think back to one of my favorite passages of Scripture. It comes from the book of Revelation. Not a lot of the things in the book of Revelation are my favorite passages, but I do like John in his ecstasy when he is pulled away from this earth and he is able to view the throne room of God. We see God in his majesty filling the entire throne room, and the angels and the elders who are worshiping and praising him, and all of these wonderful, beautiful images are there. And then John hears, echoing through the room itself, the voice of the mighty angel who would say, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" Revelation 5 verse 2. Who fulfilled the requirements that would allow him to open those seals? That's really the question. Who fulfills the requirements? Who is willing to pay the price? Who would show their worth to open the seals? Now, to us as Christians, we read that. We excite in the knowledge that the answer is the Lamb. It is Jesus Christ. It is the name around which we gather, Christian. We know who is worthy. It is Jesus. But in the first century, you've got to understand that answer only came after heartache and turmoil, culminating in the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. is worthy. Or we might ask another way, what is Jesus worth today? I think as we look at the world around us that is more progressively anti-God every day, the value of the Savior's stock, we might say, has plummeted to great depths. But we are not called upon to value the Savior en masse, but as individuals. And so the question then comes to us, not what is Jesus worth, but what is Jesus worth to you? That's the valid question. And that's the one that each one of us has to answer for ourselves. And I think sometimes out of tradition, we throw out, he's worth everything to me, because we know that's what we're supposed to say. We've been told that all of our lives since we were little bitty, or we've been told that all the time that we're in the church. We repeat it in sermons, in Bible classes, in songs that we sing, in prayers, that Jesus is all to me and things like that. But is that more tradition or habit than actual lifestyle? Julie and I like to watch those talent shows, talent competitions like America's Got Talent. And sometimes we look around and we wonder if America has any talent left, and yet this television show likes to highlight the talent that America has. Another one of my favorites is American Ninja Warrior. See all the things that I can't do. Or The Voice. And in these shows, they always have that person who's interviewing the competitor, maybe after they've won or after they've done a good job. And it's almost like they have no other question except this one. They'll say, what would a win in this competition mean to you? What would the win mean to you? And as if it's bad enough that they only have the one question to ask, the competitor only has one answer. It means everything. Means everything to me, which means precisely nothing. Okay? Those are just words. That's what we're expected to say. They read off their script. They ask the same question. They answer with the same answer. It means everything. But if you really want to see what it means to them, what does it really mean, a win here? Look at what they give up in order to find the victory. Look at what they sacrifice in their lives in order to gain victory. You want to know what Jesus means to the children of God, to each individual? Look at what they're willing to sacrifice in order to receive Him. Or on the other side of that coin, look at what they're willing to sell Him out for. What are they willing to give Him up for? In the middle of His gospel, Mark records Jesus as saying, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? Mark 8:36-7. Mark opens chapter 14 then with one of his famous sandwiches, where he has a theme and he sticks something in the middle and he returns to that theme again. So in the first 11 verses of Mark chapter 14, if you've not already turned there, I invite you to turn to Mark 14. As we look at Jesus answering this question about how people receive Him, what kind of value there is. It is a question that is answering the Christ worth to His contemporaries. What do they think I'm worth? What would they give in return for their souls? What would they give in return for me? How do they value me? And we're going to look at four particular groups or individuals in this context. See how they value Christ. And then we're going to ask that massive question, that all-important question. Not what is He worth to the Jewish leaders and the woman and things. What is He worth to me? What am I willing to give up for Christ? It begins in verses 1 and 2 with Jesus and His value to the Jewish leaders. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest Him by stealth and kill Him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Mark begins an entirely new section on the Passion of Christ in chapter 14. It is indicated by his timestamp, now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but also because of the lack of connecting anything to the events immediately prior. In fact, if we go back and we look at chapter 13, you remember there is a cutoff point, we might say, in chapter 13, when it says, and they left the temple, or as they left the temple. And you remember, this is the last time you'll see Jesus in the temple of God in the book of Mark. He never goes there again. He never darkens those doors. And so it's not just that he is moving away physically from the temple of the Jews, but that now he is cutting himself off from the temple. He goes to the mountainside, and they are overlooking the temple. And as he is making his speech, he's telling them, this is going to be destroyed, right? He is pronouncing judgment upon the temple, upon the religion of the Jews. It is all going to be cut off in the very near future. And so you have that time stamp. And now you come over here in chapter 14, 2 days before Passover and the unleavened bread. 2 days likely follows the tradition of the Jews, which was an inclusive reckoning. What that would mean would be, when we say 3 days from now, we generally use an exclusive reckoning. 3 days from now would be, you wouldn't count today, you would count tomorrow, the next day, and the day after. That'd be 3 days from now. That's what we call an exclusive reckoning. You exclude the day that you're on. The Jews didn't reckon that way. They used an inclusive reckoning. 2 days for them would be today and tomorrow. And that's most likely what Mark is using here, is that tomorrow would be the Passover. Today and tomorrow. And it begins, and it's one of the high holy feasts of the Jewish nation at that time. Passover and unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, were actually two separate events. They were distinct from one another. Passover was held on the 14th day of Nisan. It commemorated the Passover feast that they participated in Egypt, which was the final plague. You remember in Exodus chapter 12, when God is trying to get Pharaoh to let his people go, and he does a series of 10 plagues, and it culminates on this 10th plague, which is God passing over the land of Egypt. And those who are the firstborn of the people and the firstborn of the animals, they die. You can imagine in the moment that happens, the wailing and the sorrow as those who were the firstborn are suddenly dead. For they were fine and healthy all day long, but now they're dead. And the only way to save themselves from that sorrow was to take the blood of the lamb, the paschal lamb as it's referred to, and they would paint it on the doorpost and on the lintel of their homes. They would come together and they would eat this lamb. If their family was too small to consume the entire lamb, they were to gather their neighbors. Maybe their neighbors had a small family, and 2 or 3 small families would come together, and they would feast upon this lamb, and they would paint its blood on their house to protect them from the death of the firstborn. And so the Passover was a feast to commemorate that feast so many years ago. But then they were also told to be ready to leave in a heartbeat. So go ahead and mix your dough for the bread, but don't put yeast in it, don't put leaven in it, because you may not have time to let it rise. It said, in fact, that they were not to have leaven in their homes during the time of the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So when the Feast of the Unleavened Bread is given, that was one of the stipulations. And it was to commemorate that flight from Egypt, not the last plague, but the flight from Egypt, in which they wouldn't have time to let the dough rise. And that feast lasted from the 15th day of the month of Nisan to the 21st day. Because the two events were the day at one, or on the 14th and the 15th to the 21st, through the years it simply became known as the season, like the holiday season, right? We're not just talking about one event in the holiday season. We're talking about all of the holidays and all of the trimmings and all the times and the festivities and all of that together. And we call it a season. And so in very much the same way, they referred to it as the Passover season. And so many times by the first century, the Jews simply referred to it as a Passover, or they would refer to it as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they're actually talking about two distinct events. One writer in the New Testament makes that distinction of the two, though. Who is it? It's Mark right here. It's Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Mark uniquely separates the two. The chief priest at the time was Caiaphas and Annas. Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest. The Romans, in order to humiliate the Jews, often would take away things that they prized and that they valued. And so they supplanted Caiaphas as the high priest with his son-in-law named Annas. Annas was the ones that the Romans recognized as the high priest. But Caiaphas, because of his great honor and respect, was still considered high priest by the Jews. I find it interesting, though, that Mark eliminates their names. Their name, their identity really doesn't matter. What matters is the deed. Mark has alluded to their collusion before in chapter 3 and verse 6. The Pharisees went out, and they joined with the Herodians, and they sought to destroy him. Again, in Mark chapter 11 and verse 18, we see that they once again are in their collusion in order to destroy Jesus. Chapter 12 and verse 12, the Jewish leaders are again seen intending to kill Jesus. They have a plot. They are plotting in vain to kill Jesus and take away his influence. And it says here that they want to arrest him in stealth or in secret. Some translations say slyly, to avoid a riot. A riot, you think about the population of Jerusalem would swell to 2, sometimes 3 times its normal size during the time of Passover. At the same time, Rome, in its wisdom, would send extra guards to Jerusalem during the Passover season. The governor, who would have a house at Caesarea Maritima, who had a house at Caesarea Philippi, who had lots of mansions around the Palestinian area, guess where he went for Passover? He went back to Jerusalem to oversee the events of Passover. Anytime you have that many people together in one place, tempers will flare at times. Someone's going to step on someone else's toes. Fights and brawls may break out, and so they had the extra garrisons there. And it was in Herod's interest, the governor, to make sure that no riots occurred, because if the riots occurred on his watch, then Rome, the emperor, would question his ability as a leader. And so they would try to make sure that there were no riots whatsoever in Jerusalem during the Passover time, knowing that that was a heightened time. The crowds that they feared weren't the ones necessarily living in Jerusalem, but they were the ones that were coming to Jerusalem. You know where a lot of those people came from? From Galilee. The northern region. It's one of the most important regions outside of Jerusalem, but all of the people in Galilee that were faithful, and many of them were very faithful to the religion, knew that they had to go back to Jerusalem during this time. So thousands of them would trek from the northern region down to the southern region to the city of Jerusalem. Let me ask one more question about the book of Mark. Where does Jesus spend most of his time in the book of Mark? Galilee. And the people there tend to love him. There's some conflict, obviously, with the Jewish leaders and things like that, but the masses of Galilee love Jesus. And where are they during this week? They're in Jerusalem. These are the ones that they're most afraid of. But to the Jewish leader, we ask the question, what is Jesus worth? To the Jewish leaders, Jesus wasn't worth a second look. He wasn't worth a fair trial. He wasn't worth justice. Didn't come to that point. No, they had already judged him and refused to read the signs that he'd done through the miracles. They refused to listen to his message from God. They had already made up their mind, and he wasn't worth a second look. That's not much value on Jesus. What about the woman? Look at verse 3. While he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment, of pure nard, very costly. And she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Like the woman in the temple, the last time that Jesus was there in Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, the woman goes unnamed there and the woman goes unnamed here. Why? Because her identity is less important than the impact of her devotion. Her actions are the meat of this Mark sandwich, bracketed by the misunderstanding, hatred, and betrayal and the plot to kill him in verses 1 and 2 and verses 10 and 11. But this event stands in stark contrast to that betrayal. She is an outsider, and I think Mark takes great pains here to point out just how far outside she is. Notice it says that while he was at Bethany, where is Bethany? It's outside of Jerusalem. In the house of Simon the leper. Where do the lepers reside? Outside the camp. Most likely Simon the leper was a former leper, but was well known because of his disease, possibly healed by Jesus himself. Some even suggest that Simon the leper was the father of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. May have been. But nonetheless, the idea is that he is an outsider, and his house, anyone in his house, would be outsiders as well. And so here is Jesus reclining at table outside of Jerusalem in an outsider's house. And while he's there, a woman who is unnamed interrupts the fellowship at table and comes and she herself is an outsider. We don't know her. Judas was an insider, yet he betrays Jesus. The priest and the teachers thought they were insiders, but they too harbor betrayal and destruction in their hearts. The outsider, the one who shouldn't know, she is the one that comes with a generous and liberal response to Jesus. We're not shocked. I mean, we've been noticing this throughout the book of Mark, how the outsiders are the one who have greater appreciation and devotion and understanding than most of the insiders do. Once again, it's that outsider-insider, and those who are inside miss the point. But what's his worth? To the woman, Jesus was worth every precious thing she had. She emptied a year's wage worth of pure nard on his head. Think about that. How much that was worth. Some translations, put the actual amount, 300 denarii. Denarii was a word in the New Testament that's used to refer to a day's wage. That's what a denarii was. And so 300 denarii would be what the average worker would receive in 300 days of work. You take one day off a week, work 6 days a week, you've worked about what? 300 days. A year's wage worth of perfume. And she pours it on him. Now, it's doubtful that this woman who is unknown, who is an outsider, had the money simply to go and spend a year's wage to buy a bottle of perfume. Imagine if the average worker in Brighton, I believe I looked it up the other day, and it was around $37,000 a year. How many of you would go spend $37,000 on a bottle of perfume? I did last year, but no, we wouldn't do that. How do you acquire something like that? Well, and what do you do with it when you get it? Well, listen, when you acquire it by saving up and saving up and saving up, and that day that it goes on sale, if you have to have it, you buy it. But when you get it, do you know what you do with it? You protect it. You don't wear it every day. It's special occasion oil, right? It's Passover oil. It's Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of the Booths. It's the Day of Atonement. It's special oil, and you only wear it at opportune times. And when you're old, you pass it to your children, sometimes to their children and their children. Bottles like this were passed down as heirlooms. Was she the first one to have it? I don't know. Is it possible that she received it from her mother or her grandmother? Yeah, it's highly possible. And so there's more than just the actual value of the oil. There's the sentimental value. There's the, what does this mean to me value? And she takes this and she pours it on Jesus. It's an extravagance that no one would seem to even do. And yet she does. She pours it by breaking the bottle. Once you break the bottle, you know what you can't do? Reuse it. It's done. She sacrifices even the bottle to symbolize the totality of her gift. She can't get this oil back. She can't get this bottle back. She can't get the sentimentality and pass this heirloom on to her own children. It's done. The sacrifice has been made. Jesus was worth to her everything she could do. But what about the disciples? In verse 4, it continues the story. There were some who had said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." The disciples, the ultimate insiders, the 12 who had followed Jesus day in and day out for 3.5 years, yet when they saw her pouring the oil on his head, they objected. Wasteful. You can't be that extravagant. The pretense was the poor and the impoverished of the land. A year's wage, 300 denarii, could buy a lot of bread and feed a lot of people. In Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 37, or actually just earlier than that, Jesus is followed by a great multitude, and it's been a long time since they've had anything to eat. So he sits the crowd down and says to them, "Let's feed them." And you remember the disciples said to him, "Well, shall we go into town and buy 200 denarii worth of bread to feed?" And the text says that there were 5,000 men, that's not counting the women and children, 5,000 people with their companions could be fed with 200 denarii. And this was worth 300 denarii. This was worth even more than that. And they scold her. The word that Mark uses here is a very vivid picture. It is not just a simple scolding, but it's vehement. It's literally, it's with nostrils flaring, snorting of a horse. They demean her. You could have sold this. You could have helped the poor. But instead, you have wasted this ointment. Jesus, of course, defends her actions as a beautiful thing that she has done in preparing him for burial. It's the second time in this section that alludes to the death of Jesus, the first being obviously verses 1 and 2 when they were seeking to kill him. And now she is anointing him for burial. And then Judas is going to go and plot with them to betray and kill him. Each one of the paragraphs in the opening of chapter 4 is pointing to the death of Jesus. In fact, Mark gives it in such successive orders that we're not just approaching the death of Jesus. It is rapidly approaching is the idea. It's right up on us. And so we see over and over and over and over again this reference to his death. And Jesus says that you will always have poor people, but only one opportunity to anoint Jesus for his sacrifice. In chapter 12, you'll recall the scribe who came to Jesus and he said, what is the most important command? What is the first commandment? And Jesus said what? You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and all of your strength. The second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. The desire to help the impoverished and the poor and those who do not have something to eat is a fulfillment of love your neighbor as yourself. And it would seem on the surface that Jesus is supplanting that. This is more important than loving your neighbor as yourself. But it's because that was the second command. Let's go back to the primary one. Love the Lord your God. Jesus is putting himself in the place of God because he is God. That's part of Mark's entire reveal, is that Jesus is the Son of God. He is not supplanting love your neighbor as yourself. He is going to the higher principle of love God first and foremost, of which he is God. And so her story of faith and sacrifice would be proclaimed throughout the generations anytime the gospel is preached. She understood something that the disciples had yet to get, the concept of the good news of Christ and his suffering as she is there at feast with him. She did what she could do. You realize those are almost the exact words that Jesus used in chapter 12 and verse 44 to talk about the woman, the widow who gave in her 2 mites. She gave all that she had. Almost word for word, she did what she could do. You know, Jesus doesn't consider the size of your gift. He considers the ability of the giver. 2 lepta, 2 mites. For the size, that's nothing. It's insignificant. And yet, because of what the sacrifice was to her, it made all the difference. A year's wage, that's huge. But it wasn't the size. She did what she could do. It was the size of her heart that made the difference. Now, what is he worth? To these disciples, Jesus wasn't worth a year's wage. Oh, they would have said, oh, Jesus is everything to me. But when it came right down to it and they saw 300 denarii worth of oil poured on his head, they thought that was a waste on her part because Jesus wasn't worth 300 denarii. It wasn't just a demeaning of her. It was a demeaning of him as well. Oh, I don't think that they were saying Jesus wasn't worth 300, but that's the implication of their statement when they called that a waste. Faith had eaten up this outsider, but had yet to take deep hold in the hearts of the disciples. And then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, verse 10, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad. What a vile thing to be glad and joyous about. They were glad. Glad that he was willing to give him up. and they promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. What was he worth to Judas? Now, the chief priests were looking for a strategy to take Jesus slyly, verses 1 and 2. Now, Mark returns to their plot with Judas going to the chief priests. I will give you the plan that you're seeking for. And they were glad Judas wanted to destroy Jesus because that's what they wanted too. He was their end. He is the key to this entire plan happening. Now, some have speculated that Judas felt like Jesus could handle himself, so he might as well make a buck off of it, right? I've seen Jesus. I've seen what he can do. I can betray him, and he'll still take care of it. Some have said, well, Judas was a zealot like some of the other disciples, and he's tired of Jesus wasting time around in back corners on the outside in Bethany. It's time for him to make his move against Rome. It's time for him to launch an attack. So maybe Judas was thinking to himself, if I betray him, that is going to force his hand so that he will have to do what he says he's doing. Let me tell you, such altruistic motives are never spoken of about Judas. Never. Instead, the Bible describes him as one who is greedy and one who is a robber and one who is a betrayer. And they promise him money. Now, Mark doesn't tell us the amount of money because, like the identity of the people, it doesn't matter. The amount of money doesn't matter. We often go to other places, Mark and Luke, and refer to the 30 pieces of silver, and we say, oh, such a paltry amount, and things like that. If it was 60, would it be okay? If it were 6,000 pieces of silver, would it be okay? Let me ask you this, in all honesty, if it was every piece of silver and gold that the world has, would it then become okay to betray the Savior? Mark doesn't even give us an amount because there is no amount that would justify such action. Mark does not tell the amount because we sometimes get focused on that and the large or smallness of it, and we forget that it's the action itself that is so appalling. What was he worth to Judas? He wasn't worth any amount of money. Judas would rather have the money than have Jesus. And it appears any amount of money would do. They promise him some money, and he's willing to do it. He's not worth a second look to some. He's not worth a year's wage to some. He's not worth any amount of money to others. What is he worth to you? See, that's the real question. What is he worth to you? But you don't have to come to me and answer with your words. I'm not going to raise hands and take polls. Because no matter what your words may say, your actions actually tell us and tell God, more importantly, what he's worth to you. Is he worth all of you? That's what he said of the widow, all she had. Is he worth all that you can do? That's what she gave in the breaking of the flask of the oil. She's done all she could do. The world doesn't like extravagant religion. Doesn't like overly religious people. Look, you can have a lot of power and the world will admire you. You have a lot of money, a lot of sex, a lot of influence, a lot of talent, and the world admires extravagance in every avenue except for religion. You're a Jesus freak. You've put too much stock in it. You're making me uncomfortable with how much. Isn't that what the disciples are looking at? Was they watched a year's wage worth of oil drained down over Jesus' head, and they're uncomfortable with that. What a waste. The world just doesn't like extravagant faith and devotion. But you know, while they say, take your religion and do it in moderation, Jesus wants more than moderation. Jesus wants all of you. He wants more than moderation. He wants wholesale, complete, extravagant, irrational faith and devotion, and nothing less will do for the redemption by the Lamb. He is worthy. Is he worth to you, your friends? Oh, if I did that, my friends might forsake me. Is he worth your job, your family, your children? Many times when I sit down with someone who's interested in a Bible study, I ask them at the very beginning, if Jesus came today and said, in order for you to be saved, you had to give up your first child, would you do it? Your only child. All of your children. Would you give it up? Those that are dearest to your heart, would you gladly give them up for Jesus? And yet Jesus asks for nothing less, doesn't he? Is he worth your children? Is he worth your car? Is he worth that moment of flying off the handle angry? Is he worth abusing other people? Is he worth suffering inequity from the world? What is he worth to you? You can show that this morning. If you're not a child of God and you're saying to yourself, he means everything to me. That may be true. But the words mean precisely nothing. It's the actions that will follow that will say what he's worth to you. If you have a need to respond to his invitation this morning, he gladly offers you this opportunity to respond, to say to him, I'm ready. If you'll come while we stand.